There is a piece of land in West Texas that tells two completely different stories depending on which photograph you look at. The first photograph was taken in 2019. The land is gray and cracked, like the surface of a dead planet. Not a single blade of grass, not a single insect, just dust, heat, and silence. If you picked up a handful of that soil, it would fall through your fingers like ash, dry, lifeless, and completely hollow. 3 generations of the Watson family had farmed that land, and in 2019, it was finished. The second photograph was taken in 2022. Same land, same coordinates, same Texas sun beating down from above. But everything else is different. The soil is dark brown, almost black. Rows of vegetables stretch as far as the eye can see. The air smells like earth after rain. A 74-year-old man walks slowly between the rows, running his hand gently over the leaves, smiling to himself like a man who knows something the rest of the world has forgotten. That man is Earl Watson, and in 2022, he made $90,000 from that same land that experts had declared biologically dead just 3 years earlier. He spent $0 on fertilizer, $0 on chemical treatments, $0 on any of the products that the modern agriculture industry tells every farmer they cannot survive without. He used a method so old, so simple, and so effective that when word began to spread about what he had done, 3 separate U.S. states moved to restrict its use. Not because it was dangerous, but because it worked too well, and it threatened an industry worth billions of dollars. This is his story, and by the time you finish reading it, you will understand why the most powerful agricultural corporations in America are quietly terrified of a 74-year-old retired farmer from a small town in Texas. To understand what Earl Watson did, you first need to understand what happened to the land in the decades before him. Starting in the 1950s, American farming went through a revolution. Chemical companies began producing synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides on a massive scale. Farmers were told that these products were the future: higher yields, faster growth, bigger profits. The science seemed solid. The results in the first few years were genuinely impressive. Crops grew bigger and faster than anyone had seen before. But underneath the surface, something was slowly dying. Healthy soil is not just dirt. It is an incredibly complex living ecosystem. 1 single teaspoon of healthy farmland contains more living organisms than there are human beings on the entire planet. Bacteria, fungi, earthworms, microscopic insects, all working together in a system that took thousands of years to develop. This living network is what makes soil fertile. It breaks down organic matter, releases nutrients, retains water, and keeps the ground soft and workable. Without it, soil is just mineral dust. Every round of synthetic chemicals killed a portion of that underground ecosystem. In the first few years, the damage was invisible. The chemicals masked it by forcing nutrients directly into the plants. But year after year, decade after decade, the living community inside the soil grew smaller and weaker. The ground became harder and more compacted. It lost its ability to hold water. It stopped producing nutrients naturally. Farmers needed more and more chemicals just to get the same results. And then, eventually, even that stopped working. Agricultural scientists have a term for what happens at the end of this process. They call it biological soil collapse, the point at which the underground ecosystem is so damaged that the land can no longer support any meaningful crop growth, no matter how many chemicals you pour into it. By the 2010s, millions of acres of American farmland had reached this point. In Texas alone, thousands of small family farms had been abandoned. Banks were foreclosing on properties that had been in families for over 100 years. Young people were leaving farming communities because there was simply nothing left to farm. The Watson family land was one of those places. And in 2019, Earl Watson was staring at the end of everything his family had built. Earl Watson was born in 1948 on the same land where his grandfather had first broken ground in the 1920s. He grew up learning to farm the old way, watching the sky for weather, reading the soil with his hands, rotating crops the way his father taught him. For For the first 20 years of his adult farming life, things were good. Not rich, but stable. The land was generous, and the Watson family knew how to listen to it. But in the 1980s, like almost every farmer around him, Earl began switching to chemical-based farming. His neighbors were doing it. The agricultural supply companies were pushing it hard. The yields in the early years were extraordinary. Earl expanded his operation, took out loans to buy more equipment, and for a while believed that modern farming science had genuinely made everything better. He was wrong, but it took 30 years for the full cost of that mistake to become visible. By 2015, Earl's soil was in serious decline. His crop yields had dropped by nearly 60% compared to their peak. He was spending more money on fertilizers and pesticides than he was making from his harvests. He had taken out loans to cover the losses, believing each year that the next season would turn things around. It never did. In 2018, his wife of 44 years, Margaret, passed away after a long illness. The medical bills, combined with his farming debts, pushed Earl to the financial edge. His bank sent him a letter informing him that if he could not demonstrate a viable plan for the land within 18 months, they would begin foreclosure proceedings. Earl was 70 years old, alone, in debt, and farming land that no longer wanted to grow anything. Most people would have walked away. Many of his neighbors had, but Earl Watson was a stubborn man, and he had a memory that was about to save everything. Sometime in the winter of 2018, unable to sleep, Earl found himself going through old boxes in the farmhouse attic. Among the documents and photographs, he found a handwritten journal that had belonged to his grandfather, Henry Watson, who had farmed the same land in the 1920s and 1930s. Henry Watson had farmed through the Dust Bowl, one of the worst ecological disasters in American history, when poor farming practices stripped millions of acres of topsoil across the Great Plains, turning fertile land into desert and destroying thousands of farms. But Henry's land had survived. While farms around him failed completely, the Watson land had kept producing. Earl had known this as a family story his whole life, but he had never thought deeply about why. Reading through his grandfather's journal that winter night, he found the answer. Henry Watson had developed a composting and soil restoration system built entirely from what was already available on and around the farm: kitchen scraps, animal manure, crop residue, wood ash, dried leaves, and a specific combination of natural materials that created an intensely active biological environment. He layered these materials directly onto the soil in a precise sequence, allowed them to decompose over specific periods, and then worked them into the ground in a way that essentially reintroduced a living ecosystem back into damaged earth. Henry called it simply feeding the ground. He wrote in his journal that most farmers thought about feeding their plants, but the real secret, he believed, was feeding the soil itself. Healthy soil, he wrote, will grow anything. Sick soil will grow nothing, no matter what you pour on top of it. Earl read that journal 3 times before morning, and then he started. He had no money for equipment or materials. He used what was on the farm: old crop residue, manure from the few animals he still kept, kitchen waste, fallen leaves, wood ash from the fireplace, and materials he collected from the surrounding land. He followed his grandfather's system as closely as he could, adding adjustments based on what he had learned from decades of farming experience. The process was slow, unglamorous, and physically exhausting for a 70-year-old man working mostly alone. There was no chemical shortcut, no quick fix, just patient, methodical work of rebuilding something that had taken decades to destroy. He started with a small section of the land, about 2 acres, as a test. He wanted to see if the method would actually work before committing to the whole property. Within 4 months, the 2-acre test section was visibly different from the surrounding land. The soil had darkened, it had become softer and more workable. Earthworms, a critical indicator of soil health, had returned in numbers that Earl had not seen in 30 years.
He planted a small crop of tomatoes and squash on the restored section. The results were unlike anything he had seen in decades. The tomatoes from that first 2-acre test section grew to a size and quality that Earl struggled to describe without sounding like he was exaggerating. They were dense, deeply colored, and intensely flavorful in a way that commercially grown produce almost never is. When he brought samples to a local farmer's market, he sold out within 2 hours. People came back the following week asking where the rest was. Earl spent the next year scaling the method across his entire property. It was not a fast process. Different sections of the land had different levels of damage and required different amounts of time and material to restore. But section by section, the land came back to life. By the end of 2021, he had restored nearly 18 acres to full biological health. In 2022, Earl's farm generated $90,000 in revenue. He grew tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, squash, and several heritage vegetable varieties that had become nearly impossible to find in commercial markets. He sold through local farmers markets, a small number of restaurants in the region, and a community-supported agriculture subscription that had a waiting list by mid-season. His total input cost for soil management that year was $0. Everything he used came from the farm itself or from freely available natural materials nearby. Word began to spread. Other farmers in the region heard about what Earl had done and came to see it for themselves. Agricultural bloggers wrote about it. A small documentary crew from an independent media outlet spent a week on the farm filming. The story moved from local curiosity to something with a much wider audience. And that is when the trouble started.
The modern agricultural industry is not a collection of small family businesses. It is a multi-billion-dollar system built around the continuous sale of inputs: fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, specialized seeds, soil treatments, and the equipment required to apply all of them. American farmers spend hundreds of billions of dollars on these products every year. The companies that produce and sell them have extraordinary financial and political power. When a method began attracting serious attention that allowed farmers to completely bypass all of those products, producing equal or superior results at zero cost, it was not going to be ignored. Within 18 months of Earl's story gaining wider attention, legislation appeared in 3 states that effectively restricted or prohibited specific elements of the composting and soil amendment practices central to his method. The legislation was framed in terms of environmental protection and biosafety, concerns about unregulated organic materials being introduced into agricultural soil. Critics, including several agricultural scientists who had studied Earl's method independently, argued that the legislation had nothing to do with environmental safety. The materials involved were entirely natural, had been used in farming for thousands of years, and posed no documented environmental risk. The timing of the legislation, appearing almost immediately after the method began receiving significant media attention, was difficult to explain as coincidence. Earl Watson himself was characteristically direct about it. In one interview, he said simply, "They're not scared of my dirt. They're scared of my receipts, because my receipts show zero, and theirs show billions." The controversy brought even more attention to the method. It also brought legal complexity that made it harder for farmers in those states to implement the full system without navigating a maze of new regulations. As the method spread and more farmers attempted to replicate what Earl had done, a clear pattern of common errors emerged. The most frequent mistake was impatience. Earl's restoration of his test section took 4 months before visible results appeared. Many farmers attempting to copy the method expected results within weeks, became discouraged, and abandoned the process before it had time to work. Biological soil restoration is not a chemical process with immediate and predictable timelines. It is a living system, and living systems move at their own pace. The second common mistake was incorrect layering and ratios of materials. Henry Watson's original journal specified a particular sequence and proportion of different organic materials that created the right biological conditions for rapid microbial activity. Farmers who improvised freely with the ratios often created compost that was either too dry, too nitrogen-heavy, or lacking in the fungal activity that is critical to the method's effectiveness. Earl spent considerable time in interviews and public appearances explaining the specific details that most people were getting wrong. The third mistake was applying the method to soil that had not been properly assessed first. Different types of soil damage required different approaches in the early stages. Highly compacted clay soil needs a different preparation than sandy, nutrient-depleted soil. Attempting to apply a single identical process to every type of damaged land without accounting for the specific nature of the damage produced inconsistent results and led some farmers to conclude incorrectly that the method did not work. Earl was generous with his knowledge about all of these mistakes. He gave interviews, answered questions at farming conferences, and invited other farmers to his land to see the process firsthand. The fundamental principle behind what Earl Watson did is not complicated. It is the patient, deliberate rebuilding of a living underground ecosystem using only what nature already provides. You begin by stopping. Stop adding synthetic chemicals to your soil. Every application of conventional fertilizer or pesticide continues to damage the biological community you are trying to restore. This step is difficult for farmers who are dependent on chemical inputs for their current yields, but it is non-negotiable. You cannot rebuild a living system while simultaneously poisoning it. You then begin collecting organic materials, crop residue from previous harvests, animal manure if available, kitchen organic waste, fallen leaves, wood ash, and any other decomposable natural material accessible to you. These are layered onto the soil surface in a specific sequence designed to create the ideal temperature, moisture, and chemical environment for maximum microbial activity. The layered material is turned and managed over a period of several months, then worked into the soil at the right moment of decomposition. The biological activity that results from this process begins reintroducing the organisms that healthy soil requires: bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and the complex interdependencies between them that turn dead mineral ground back into living farmland. The process costs nothing except time, attention, and physical effort. It requires no proprietary products, no specialized equipment, and no ongoing purchases of any kind. Once healthy soil biology is reestablished, it largely maintains and regenerates itself, the way it did for thousands of years before modern chemical farming disrupted it. Earl Watson did not set out to challenge an industry or start a movement. He was a tired old man trying to save his family's land because he did not know how to do anything else. He found an answer in a handwritten journal in an attic, tried it because he had nothing left to lose, and discovered that the answer his grandfather had written down 100 years ago still worked perfectly. What he proved was something that agricultural scientists who work outside the industrial farming system have been saying for decades: that the soil does not need the industry. The industry needs the soil to be sick. A farmer with healthy living soil does not need to buy anything. And a farmer who does not need to buy anything is a farmer that the modern agricultural supply chain cannot profit from. 3 states have moved to restrict the practices he used. The industry has largely ignored or dismissed his results in its official communications. The legislation continues to be challenged by farming advocacy groups who argue it is being used to protect corporate interests rather than public safety. Meanwhile, on 18 acres of West Texas land that was declared biologically dead in 2019, an old farmer continues to wake up before sunrise, walk his rows in the early morning quiet, and grow food in soil so alive you can smell it from 10 feet away. He made $90,000 last year. He will likely make more this year. And he spent $0 on soil.